Welcome to the BEZA Performance live stream. Today is S&OP Thursday again, and my friend and colleague Doug Dedman is with us again today. Let me pull him up here real quick. Howdy, Doug.
Hey, Marshall, how are you?
So this is our second in the installment series we're doing of live streams called "What Does Good Look Like?" Obviously pertaining to S&OP. What's the topic today we've got about 8 or 9 of them. I think you're doing, Doug. What are we talking about today?
Yeah, so today we had kind of raised eight areas, but today we're going to talk about the family structure. So
Okay.
how does the family structure get us to where we need to be to make executive S&OP work?
Okay. So before we do that, let me do the level set I always do just to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page where we are in terms of our thinking on S&OP. We think that S&OP really is the president's handle on the business, the person who owns both demand and supply and can make resource allocation decisions there. And so to that end, you ought to be able to create a clear link between strategy and execution. You should be able to set the flow rate for the business, and that means the president would be actively involved in that, setting that flow rate by family, at least ratifying it, and we'll talk a bit about that today. You should be able to establish clear, responsible, and accountable accountabilities using the process, so you know when things don't go well, where to go to fix problems, and then ultimately there's a regular and repeatable management process every month. This is a rhythm that you get in, and that rhythm provides improvement. You get measurable results, but those results should also be improved, and part of the improvement process would be improving S&OP itself. The more you do S&OP, the more good you get at S&OP. All right.
Yeah.
Let me fire up. Let me fire up your presentation and let you kind of speak into it here.
Yeah, absolutely. So last week we did introduce these kind of 8 areas of, under the guise of what does good look like. Thinking about the executive S&OP process. And this is not by no means an exhaustive list. However, as we talked about, the when you look at the things that are important or the things that you've got to have, really these were the 8 things. And so I'm not going to go through them all today again. But the one that we want to focus on is on the family structure as a starting point. And
Okay.
I think it's pretty important. Hopefully, if you can remember the points that you had brought up earlier on, Marshall, just in our framework for S&OP, what we look like, a lot of the things we're going to talk to today are about the decision-making process, right? Setting the flow rate, those sort of things. And a lot of it comes down to the really important thing of how do we how do we set up the family structure?
Right.
The other thing that we had introduced last week was this idea that just kind of just some very simple questions that you can ask yourself to say, is my executive S&OP process working well? And these are the things that then lead into, okay, well, how do I make it work better? And so I like to look at it from the executive S&OP meeting. That critical meeting happens at the end of every month, right? That's the culmination of the whole process. And when we talk about it, look at that executive meeting. First question I challenge people to ask themselves is our executive meeting a report out or is it a decision-making meeting? Should be a decision-making meeting. And if it's not, okay, that's something you want to dig into. Why is that the case? The second thing is, can I get through the entire business in 1 to 1.5 hours? Right. So that's another really important one because how I'm getting there and how I'm presenting the data, that's pretty critical.
That's not one family. That's the whole business.
That's the entire business, right? Does everyone?
So if you've made 30 families, that's going to be tough.
Right, and we'll talk about that
Sure.
in this piece, right? Does everyone walk out of the executive S&OP meeting on the same page, ready to execute the plan that's been presented? And then, really, finally, is the senior executive engaged in the meeting? And the way I would describe that is if you drew one of those conversation, maps where you map who's all engaged in that and who talked to whom in the meeting. If most of those arrows in that are going back to the executive, then they're engaged in the process. And so without getting real complicated, those are really the questions you want to ask. And we're going to focus on the family structure, on how do you get these things to happen the way they should be happening.
So a simple set of questions to kind of maybe not diagnose necessarily what's wrong, but to tell you that there's a problem, then all 8 of these areas are what feed this, and they all need to be functioning well in order for these 4 questions to
Right.
okay.
Yep. Yep. Beyond the gut feel that, man, I wish it could be better. This is just a quick way to do that check.
I'll
So
just
if
do a
we,
quick plug, Doug, for our assessment that's coming out. We have a detailed version. It's not 4 questions. It's more like 30 or 40, and that'll be something we'll make sure we communicate with everybody when it's released this
yep.
month.
Yep. Yep. That's an excellent point. So when I look at the family structure, the things I wanted to kind of cover today, really kind of the 5 big ones that I would look at in how you structure your S&OP families for presenting in the executive meeting, right? And so if I look at it, these to me are kind of the big 5.
Yeah.
Got to be constraint based, got to do the family and common units. You have to have the ability to break demand into different demand streams. I'll explain what I mean by that. It's got to facilitate buffer management, and you really should have no more than 15 in the executive meeting. And we'll talk about that at the end. It's an important one, but it's that one will if you're going to get through it in an hour and a half, you can't have 20, 30 families.
Yeah,
So
you're probably not if you have 15, you're not going to cover each one in detail. Some of them are going to be, yeah, that one's fine, same as last month,
right,
let's move forward.
exactly. So the first point that I put up there is probably one of the real critical ones is the family needs to be tied to a specific constraint. So when we're having the discussion in the S&OP meeting, we're consolidating all of that data for a family up to a constraint level. Now, a constraint could be a specific machine, it might be a production line, might be labor, something around that idea of a constraint so that all of the products in that family rely on the output of that constraint. And
Yeah,
that's the crux, the starting point for the S&OP process. Because if you think through the decisions that we talked about, one of them was setting the flow rate for the business. And
sure.
the flow rate is related to the constraint, right? That goes back to our, whether it's theory of constraints or if we think about it from a lean perspective and we're trying to
Yeah,
think about, what is the
Kanban.
output of this
Yeah,
constraint? Yeah, Kanban, all that side of things. So to me, it's a non-negotiable. You
right.
really have to get it to that level,
Yeah,
right?
we get into a lot of conversation with folks about why, but I guess at the end of the day, it just boils down to you can't ship it unless you make it or buy it, and that's all supply side. We talked briefly before we got on today. In theory, the math works both ways, right? It's demand streams or demand side or supply side, but pretty much most businesses want to see demand before they start making stuff or buying it, or some reflection of demand might be
Yep.
predicted demand, and that's another reason it flows that way. You're not going to be able to meet the demand if your constraint won't allow you, and you need to know that in advance so you can decide what you're going to do about it. And I think this is almost axiomatic. I mean, I don't know how you can violate this and expect to have a good S&OP process. Well, I wouldn't say a good, but a great S&OP process. It's going to be really
Yep.
difficult.
Well, and so if you think about it, right? So if I'm going to do a constraint based plan and I'm thinking about, I've got limited resources and I think about that in terms of capital, right? I'm going to I have to know what I have to be able to bring my demand up to that constraint level and
Yeah,
have some expression of that capability. So I know, where I'm at right now, is that where I need to be or should I be increasing that? And typically, that's going to mean some level of investment if I'm going to increase or if I have to bring that down. And so we have to know what that capability is and we have to understand when that constraint can be changed, right? So whether that's hiring or whether that's, some additional investment. And then, as I mentioned before, it's got to set that or support setting that flow rate for the business, right? And so when and I thought what I would do with this is go through a couple examples. I don't know how well it is to see these charts. You might want to pull us off the screen for a second. And these are just real simple. But if I looked at it, that blue line is my constraint line. And in the situation that I have here, and I don't know, you probably can't see my cursor, right, Marshall, if I do
no,
this. But anyways, so if you look at that blue line, that's my my constraint level. And if I've now got my unconstrained demand, here's a situation where I've got to look at that and I've got a decision to make. Do I want to follow that demand? Do I want to get to where we think that demand is going to be? And then how far in advance do I need to make that decision?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the other major questions is that a blip, or is that an expected place that we're going to be, right? Because if it's just a blip, I might be able to manage that by either allowing my lead times to stretch out, right?
Yeah.
Or by not having that, I almost get into the case of, well, my default strategy is I'm just going to chase that demand that's there. And so having that capability is a pretty important one. So that's growing demand. I could have
Yeah, and
another
before you
one.
move to the next one,
Oh,
I
sure.
just wanna reemphasize for folks that we would say it's a minimum of 12 months that you look forward on everything S&OP, rolling 12 for the very reasons Doug's already talked about. You can't make most of the decisions you would need to make about what the ramifications are of your constraint, based families, whether it's capital investment or reallocation of who's getting what. Generally, you need at least a year to think through some of
Yep.
that. Even if you're only looking forward 3 to 6 months, you're probably just talking about how you're going to deliver what's already been sold in many businesses, at least. So I
Yep.
didn't want to
Yep.
steal your thunder on that, but I wanted to make
No,
sure we
no,
did
it's
know.
a good point, and I mean, because when you look at those decisions, you've got to be able to make them far enough in advance, right? Like,
Right.
so that 12 months is typically a minimum for that.
I would think
So
so.
the second example that we had that I pulled up there was this idea of seasonal demand, and we see this often, right? Where the overall capability is matched to what my overall demand is, but I got to deal with seasonality, and so now but I need to be able to see that. I need to know that I'm matched up there. And now I've got a couple different strategies that I can employ for this, right? I could say I'm just going to chase demand for the first 4 months of this. While I'll just produce to the demand level. And then when I get into that busy part of the season, I might allow my lead times to stretch out. And then when I get down into the lower point again, the question is, well, do I then kind of bleed off that lead time in that period of time? Or do I build inventory ahead of time, right? So, however, the assumption here is that that's balanced. I could have a situation, and this is where it's so important to get that sales view, and then that even the longer than the 12 months. If I'm in a seasonal view, but if you look at it, my demand is actually rising up, so I don't quite have enough capability. I want to be able to see that. And a lot of this is about assessing what we think that future demand looks like against our capabilities, so we're making those right decisions. Because if you wait till you're in the month where you have to make the decision, you're usually going to be too late.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yes.
and and so you really want to, goes back to my point, you really want to have that capability, and be able to see the plan by summed up to that capability level, because you've got to be able to make those decisions.
So this is about a constraint-based family supply focus, if you want to think of it that way, and then we've aggregated the demand into buckets, and we'll talk about that. But then we've got demand coming in buckets, different kinds of buckets called demand streams. I know you're going to get to that, but then we've aggregated it against that constraint based family to make these decisions.
Right, right. And that's how you want to think about it in that executive meeting, to say,
Yeah.
okay, have we actually come up with the right strategy, right? So in other words, do I have that picture of demand against capability, so I'm actually able to track my strategy? And do I actually express that strategy? It's quite amazing how many places that we work with where you kind of ask, well, what strategy are you deploying
Yeah.
on this? And it's like, well,
And
we
that's
don't
the very first thing that S&OP ought
it,
to be doing for you. It's giving you
right,
that clear
right.
link.
Exactly. So that really kind of gives the idea of the capability side.
Okay.
That and really it dovetails nicely into this next one, because I can't have that conversation and put that chart together unless everybody's looking at common units. And I just said sales and operations on this, but I could add, engineering. If I've got new product introduction coming on, we have to be talking in the same language. And so that means
Yeah.
all data has to be expressed in the same unit of measure: bookings, shipments, backlog, production and capability, and inventory. And revenue doesn't work. Revenue is so go back to the fundamental related to the constraint based family. It's really, really hard to express a revenue often. It's not impossible, but it's pretty hard to express your constraint in terms of revenue.
Yeah, you'd
Um,
have to have an average that doesn't move, basically, somehow, which we just
right.
don't experience that very often. And
Yep. Yep. You're
so
adding the
ninety
problem is
percent of the time, is if in discrete manufacturing environments, we're talking about units, whether it's assemblies
yep,
or projects, but it's a unit that is the unit is units of some
right.
sort, right? Yeah,
Right. And it doesn't mean that this is the only thing you're necessarily going to look at your S&OP, but I would say that you want to start at that common unit pieces. You can work it back to revenue, but some things just don't make sense to express in revenue.
yeah,
Inventory
yeah,
typically doesn't make sense to express in terms of revenue.
right.
And so now you're actually asking people to do some math on top of actually looking at a bunch of numbers, and that gets a little bit challenging.
Yeah,
So I bringing this slide up, just this idea. This is that 5-section sheet that really has those
yeah.
pieces of data that I talked about, right? Bookings, shipments, backlog, my supply plan, which has capability as part of that, and my inventory plan. And if you look at that, I've got to have those all in the same unit because it's essentially a math problem in how well balanced is the plan. And I'll talk about that a little bit more on the buffer side of things. But you can see I'm looking at that accountability in there from the sales to the operations side. And I've got to be able to pull that together and not ask people to be translating all the time.
So if you take the idea of those 5 things need to be expressed in common units, and then you add the idea that you want to see them all on the same screen so you can understand how they're interacting in terms of a balance plan, that is the 5-section sheet. You get there immediately.
Yep, absolutely. And so the common units and the family by constraint are critical to actually setting up this 5-section sheet, which is a really the best way that we've found
Yeah.
to present all of the kind of trade-offs and the inputs into the plan process. So this is by family as we go through there, which really kind of leads into the next piece that I mentioned, and you kind of jumped on this, was this concept of the demand streams, right?
Mhm.
So how am I going to segment my demand? And we've shown this slide in other live streams, but I think it hopefully helps people understand the idea that a lot of people think about S&OP and they'll say, well, you have to look at it externally based on demand because that's the issue we're trying to solve. And I'm
Which we
not
actually
arguing.
agree with, but we just don't
Right,
they build the
right.
families that way. Yeah.
You've got to build the families in a way that allow you to move from that unconstrained view. So everything above the line there down to the constrained view. And the constrained view is the thing that you control, right? Like you're thinking about my constrained view, whether or not you're producing or you're buying from a third party contract manufacturer. You're making decisions about how much am I going to bring in order to supply to the customer, and that's all using resources that whether it's you're putting it in inventory, whether your capital investment. So I have to think about it from a constrained standpoint to get there. And so when we bring this up, we talk about it in a couple ways. One is around the process. I'm not going to spend time on that today, the exec S&OP process, but the other big
Right.
part of that is the family structure. And so below the line, you can see that yellow box there. That's the S&OP family organized by internal resources or constraints. That's what you saw when I popped up the
Yes.
5-section sheet earlier. But feeding into that, as you alluded to, Marshall, is I have these different demand streams that are more my market view. And typically, you can see here, it might be, and I think I have it on the next slide, but I'm going to break those out potentially by the way I'm going to the market, by the way the demand is segmented, and I'm tracking it at that level, and I'm validating that the plans that we're putting together, whether that's forecast, whether that's whether we're going through some promotion plan, whether things are happening the way that we want them to happen or we're expecting them to happen with an accountability level, right? And so that's what those demand streams
And
do for us.
just to be clear, that's obviously a simplification of the idea of that structure of demand streams to constraint-based families is many to many. So you can have demand streams that feed multiple families, even multiple businesses. We've got several clients that have that sort of a model where they have uh, different S&OP processes running in different businesses, but some of their solution set is from the different businesses. So all of that can be many to many, I guess, is my emphasis. It looks like it's a many to one here, but that's
Well,
just to
yeah,
make the point.
you can do that if for example, if I'm selling to an integrator, right, who's buying multiple products from me, right, I might do my demand planning at kind of their volume level, right? So, but
Mhm.
what I have to do in that demand stream is I do have to split that between, well, what families internally does that impact, right? Because they might be
Yeah.
buying three different families, but I might be concerned about, I need to know what kind of volume it's driving to each of those families. So, yeah, it can be many to many. And that gets pretty complex on how you do that. But a lot of that stuff you're doing in your demand planning now.
Yeah.
But ultimately, you need to be able to link that kind of unit plan, if you will, by that particular demand stream, if that was an integrator, to those multiple families. So probably a little more complex than what we want to cover in this first
Sure.
first go
But
around.
it's family
Yeah,
structure, so that's the
it's
idea.
family structure. Yeah. So typically the way I look at this, the potential breakdowns, and the one we often will start with is project versus flow. It might be by major customers, might be distributors versus end customers, might be by geographical areas and by OEMs. Um, One of the things I would say on this, the purpose of this is to improve the demand planning so you can apply the right forecast methodology and hold the right accountability on that, right? So um, uh, it what you don't want to get into with those demand streams is, and I use a rule of thumb on this, if you have more than 8 demand streams, you're probably looking at your business too finite for the S&OP process. We're
Yeah.
not trying to replicate the whole demand planning process into S&OP. What we want to do is validate that, is your demand planning process working,
Right.
right?
And
Is it
we're trying to model your go-to-market strategy. So
right?
that's
And
usually
market your
not
go
going to be 8 demand
right.
streams.
So the example I like to use with that one as a simple starting point is if this was my historical demand, just a real simple graph, it's all over the map, real hard for me to do any kind of prediction on that, right? Like, okay, so that's my historical. What is January going to look like? Well, I don't know. December was a big number. Is that a trend? One of the things we look at is saying, hey, can I break out the projects versus the flow business? And so that often means taking the demand, figuring out an order level that would represent a project. So in this example here, that order level is 4 units. And if we took out all the orders greater than 4 units or more, I got a really nice, steady, probably statistically significant, and my ability to plan that, my flow bookings, and then I could overlay my project bookings, which would have a different demand planning process, and I would consolidate those two into one family, into that family that we're talking about, which would give me what my constraint view would look like, right? And so if you think about this in terms of that execution, even, right, that flow business probably has a much shorter lead time in terms of the replenishment to the customer versus those projects where, I want to set a different kind of lead time, manage a different backlog buffer level than I do for that flow business. And so this starts to support some of the other pieces that we will talk about on the family structure here. But that's just to
Yeah.
give you an example, the one that we often look at, where if I've got spiky demand, how do I break it between those two pieces, flow versus project.
And that's not the only split we do, but that's a great representative example, I guess, of
Right.
why demand streams are modeled as streams flowing into an aggregated constraint-based family.
Yep. Yep. So we've covered off the family by constraint. We've covered off the common units. We've covered off the demand streams. I want to talk for a minute about buffers, and I've kind of mentioned this already. And this is that strategy piece that kind of how does strategy come out in execution. So if we think about the 5-section sheet, which is really a presentation of the model that we're expecting how we're expecting the business to run. So we have our bookings, which is, as we said, accountable to sales. And we've got our shipments, which is our plan of what we can actually produce. Well, the difference between those is my backlog. And backlog is a buffer. So it's the difference between bookings and shipments. So if I book more than what I ship, that backlog is going up. Fairly obvious, right? So in a month, if I
Sure.
book more than what I've shipped, backlog is going to increase. Well, there's two kind of important things when you look at that buffer management. And one is, what is that overall backlog? So in the example here, if you look at that, where that second green arrow is, in that gray column, it says, I think there's just about 22,000 units in total backlog. Well, if I look at it and they're shipping on that shipment line about 2,300 units a month, that means they would have 10 months of total backlog. That doesn't mean they can ship 10 months right away, right? But they've got 10 months of total backlog. And so when we're thinking about that backlog buffer and managing that buffer, is what is my total backlog? But then also, what is my shippable backlog? And if you pull that back up again, Marshall, the part on the shippable backlog really is that the top arrow there, which is my age backlog when I can ship them out. So that's kind of that buffer, and backlog ties directly to lead times, right? So if you think about that backlog, it ties directly to customer lead times. The greater your backlog, the greater your lead time.
Right.
And that's a pretty strategic buffer to be thinking about. So
Yeah.
yeah. It also is the way that you buffer supply planning, right? So, for example, if you're in a project business, right, you might require a certain amount of backlog because you have to buy specific components for a project. And if I don't have that backlog, I don't have enough time. I might, it might be great. The customer wants to have it in 2 weeks. But I might not be able to get all the components I have, and so I have to promise it a period of time out there. Well, having the right amount of backlog is pretty important in that business, in the project business. So um, the other buffer, which we've really talked about without doing a constraint-based family, you do not see, is really your supply buffer, right? Which is the difference between your capability and what your production plan is, right? And sometimes we'll express that in terms of what we'll call upside flex. Where can you get to? And often there's some specific thought around that, just in terms of, well, I can utilize my upside flex for 1 month, but after that I've bled all of the buffer of my components and I can't use it again. So the family structure is so important that it allows you to do those two buffers. Well, the other one, which we're probably all real familiar with, because it's the one that shows up on our on our balance sheet, but also the one that often gets cut, and that's our inventory buffer, right? And that really is, you can think about this, it's the buffer between production and shipments, or it's how do I manage an expected customer lead time compared to what my supply chain lead time is. And included in that is my build lead time. So if that customer expected lead time is a lot shorter than what it takes me to produce something, I want to be building some inventory so that I can do that. So the point about the family structure is I need to be able to put all of these things together, which requires those common units, requires it by constraints so that I can actually manage those buffers, which goes back to what you talked about at the beginning, which is those decisions that I make and I'm running the business or maybe not running the business. Right.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, I'm always convinced that the 5 section sheet is sort of simple brilliance or something like that. Like it just collapses all these really important ideas into something that it works. It doesn't mean we never show anything besides a 5 section sheet in executive meetings, but you got to show the 5 section sheet in the meetings where we support people doing S&OP, so they can all be rallied around. Everyone can be rallied around the decision making that's going to turn into the marching orders after the meeting's over,
Yeah. And it
based
goes
on the
back to,
buffering.
yeah, and it goes back to what I said at the very beginning. Is everybody come out with the same plan? And the frustration if you don't do this and you don't get to that kind of common view across sales and operations, both in units and in the families,
Yeah,
well, it's really hard for somebody to walk out with what the clear picture of what we're going to do is and what really are the trade-offs we're talking about. And so, when we look at it, that's where that's a real critical part. And I mean, it sounds a bit complicated, but it's actually not. It's the
yeah,
challenge is that often it forces us into conversations we might not be actually having that we should be
yeah,
having. So it can be uncomfortable as opposed to complicated. Maybe is the way I would.
yeah. I like that, and comfortable in a positive way. Like people who need
Yes.
to, think through the inventory is the perfect example of where it's almost always, until S&OP is in place, considered to be an operational problem if inventory isn't, in the right isn't the right number of turns or whatever.
Right.
But we've had plenty of clients that after implementing S&OP, they see that, oh, the reason our inventory is out of whack is we had a build plan for shipments that didn't happen because sales didn't sell them. So, we got to make a decision on what we're going to do moving forward from a supply side standpoint to help fix that inventory issue. But the other side of the equation on the demand is the one that's going to need to get addressed. I remember distinctly having a conversation with an executive about how that was, how literally, the executive who the president had kind of said, we're building this stuff to get ready, and then sales didn't sell it, and then he went back to ops and said, how come there's all this inventory?
Right.
He
Right.
was not
Right.
an idiot or something. I mean, it was just one of those things where it just sort of got lost in the shuffle until you had the clear picture there of what had happened.
Yep. Yep. And that goes back to the point of, if you ask yourself the question, is everybody got a clear picture
Clear.
of what we're executing coming out of this and are ready to execute it versus walking out going, well, I got a clear picture of it, but I sure didn't agree with it. Right. So,
Well, can you go
um,
back one slide too, just
absolutely.
so we can emphasize that? I I just like to always emphasize, for example, when Doug says that, when we leave the meeting, the supply plan is actually what operations is going to go build that month. Like that's the actual number of units in this family you're going to build. Now, how do you do that? And how do you make that connection is a whole separate issue, master scheduling or some sort of, lean Kanban, tuning Kanban setting. But that's got to happen, right? If the
Right.
supply leaves, if the operations leaves the meeting and says, well, the supply plan for the S&OP says X, but I got other ideas because we get different inputs. Well, that something's broken there.
And the beauty of what we do with this, and you're right. Sometimes I forget I forget what you say, the simple elegance of that.
Yeah,
Part of the beauty of it is that we always present last plan and this plan, so you
yeah,
can see where the changes are happening in the plan, and more importantly, is you are seeing what happened last month compared to the plan, and you're building, and we hold that going back into history, so that you're basically creating a proven track record, hopefully, right, of being able to deliver what you said you were going to deliver. And
yeah.
that's
Back
a
to the fifth item here. You get measurable results, and then when you don't hit your plan, you can ask why in a
yeah,
positive go forward way, and then you get better at planning, which is the whole idea of S&OP. So
yeah. So all of that on that family, like this does not happen if you don't set the family structure up
right,
properly to get to that. And so really kind of the last point on that, and you kind of alluded to this before, was how many families can I have for an executive S&OP meeting? And, here's just the thing. If I have 20 families, if all of the families had equal volume, each family will only be 5% of the business. And you have to ask yourself, does this level of granularity work for an executive S&OP meeting? So I
Good
use
clarifying question.
yes.
Usually the one
So
percenters are not needed in the S&OP
right,
meeting.
exactly. So we know that, it's usually everybody's business is kind of the 80-20. That's kind of a standard thing. So the point on that comment and why I put it in there is if you're if you're into like really nitty gritty detail in the executive S&OP and you've got a whole ton of different families that you're going through, you really want to look at that and say, well, does it come up to the level of what I want to talk to in the executive meeting? And that's because really you want to have that be a succinct meeting that the executives engaged in. And sometimes what happens, and one of the executives that I worked with, I loved how he put it. He goes, I don't need to see all the details of everything that went into that, because that's actually what you guys are trying. That's what I'm paying you guys to do,
Yeah.
right? That's what you're paid to do. I want to be able to come into this meeting. I want to be able to have you present what you think we should be doing, evaluate, do I agree with that? Is it risky? Is it, what's the risk level? And then understand, okay, well, this is the decision. I agree with your decision, or I agree where we're going forward. Or if we have to do a course correction, right? Whether that's increased capability, whether that means layoffs, all of those sort of things, that we are able to make those decisions. So,
Yeah, I think
yeah,
the stumbling point there is you got to come in prepared, but you're asking the executive to make a decision if nothing else than ratifying your plan, but you also have to be ready to share your rationale for the plan.
right.
But your rationale for the plan doesn't need to be the first 30 slides for the family, which is what we see all the time, right? Like there's sort of trying to get consensus in every single input into the plan, and that's really not what the executive S&OP meeting's about. That's the pre
Yeah.
S&OP meeting.
Well, and we'll talk about presentation as one of the
Yeah.
sessions that we go through. That we're going to cover the monthly process, which is the lead up. We're going to cover that next. And it's all of the stuff that you do before the executive meeting that gets you prepped so you can present at the right level of granularity and get through the things. But then the other part of that is, well, what should you present, right? And so we'll talk about that. That'll be in 2 sessions from now. But yeah, we'll cover the process, and then we'll cover that presentation. I know we've had quite a few questions on that one. How do we actually present it? And
Yeah.
yeah, I don't want to assume the family piece is right. That's why I thought it was a pretty good one to come out. So your takeaways from this really should be, and if you pull that up, maybe just to summarize this. So from a family perspective, number one, and probably most important, should be constraint based. You've got to use common units across sales and operations. You need to have some way to accommodate and to improve your demand planning, and those demand streams are the way to do that. The caveat being, don't go crazy with them. Don't try to replicate everything you're doing in demand planning. Use it for accountability. Use it for different go-to-market strategies. The fourth one is really the buffer management, right? So I've got to be able to see those buffers, because that is how we set and evaluate our strategy, and is it working? And then really you should have no more than 15 families at the executive level. You could do some more detail in the process leading up, but when you get to that executive family view, really should be no more than 15 families.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just going back through all the projects we've done, I can only think of one where we had like 23. We violated our own rule, but that was because they had just acquired a bunch of business, and so it made sense to kind of look at some of the one percenters for a while because they had to get the lay of the land there and make sure they were doing a good job. But it's just pure math. I don't know how, if you get over 15, you can even justify the
Yeah.
time. So
Yep. Yep. So hopefully that is a good covering of that piece. As you mentioned, Marshall, we're really hoping mid-August to get our the assessment that we're working on together to get that out there, which would cover some of this. You'd be able to go through some of these questions in a bit more detail and look at that. So just we'll keep people posted on that as we go through that. But yeah, hopefully this is informative for people as we dig into what makes it work better.
Yep. Well, great job, Doug. Appreciate your time today. We'll be continuing to talk about what does good look like moving forward. And our next topic is, you're going to have to remind me, I forgot what was on that.
We're going to be covering the monthly process.
That's right. So the monthly process will be the next time. And I believe that's going to be the fourth week of August. And until then, thank you very much for joining our podcast, our live stream with BEZA Performance. Thanks, Doug.
All right.